So thanks again for answering my invitation. And today I kind of want to talk about like brain, breathing, and barefoot. So still, I know we've done this before, but still, can you like introduce yourself for the audience?
Yes, absolutely. So Dr. Emily, I am a functional podiatrist, human movement specialist in the US. Now I live in Arizona specifically. And in addition to having my medical background, I've been in fitness for over 22 years. I am the founder of EBFA Global, which is an education company. We have various certifications and continuing education based around feet, barefoot, foot to core fascial fitness. And then I'm also the founder of Naboso, which is a sensory product line that I developed to help people connect to their feet, posture, and movement.
Cool. So I watch a lot of like online conference on the EBFA YouTube channel. So there's a lot of questions based on your like online conference. So the first question would be like, what's the exteroception and interoception?
Yes, so exteroception and interoception, both of those are referring to our sensory relationship to various sensory stimulation, okay? And with exteroception being extero is external. So that means what is our perception or relationship to sensing the external environment. That would be light, sound, touch, vibration, joint stretch. So all of that sensory stimulation that we often think about initially from a performance or a movement perspective, that's exteroception. And two of the main types of exteroceptors are mechanoceptors and proprioceptors, where most people are familiar with proprioception and proprioceptors, which are a type of exteroceptor or type of exteroception, okay? Now, the biggest difference between mechanoception and proprioception and proprioceptors are your joint capsules. So it's muscle spindles, GTOs, that muscle tendon junction, stimulating a stretch reflex, or what's called joint position sense. And then mechanoception is more touch. So it's glabrous skin, hands, and feet. That is going to be texture, which is Naboso, vibration, and skin stretch. Again, exteroception. On the other side is interoception. Interoception is our sensory relationship with our internal environment. That's going to be sensitive to interoceptive or interoceptor stimulation. And interoceptors are found on our visceral means gut. So your visceral fascia, your gut lining, so your stomach and intestinal lining. It is very much based off of breath and perception of safety. So internally, a lot of our sensory relationships have to do with safety. And do I have palpitations? Do I feel butterflies in my stomach? Do I feel myself flushing? And both of those are actually very closely interrelated, especially in the brain and how the brain processes them. And then if we think of like an athlete has to be very much connected to their external environment, right? Because they're navigating their body against other maybe opponents or to navigate a court or a field, right? And then on the inside, they're trying to navigate their nervousness for the game, the mental kind of connection. They could psych themselves out. How do they control their breath? Are they in control of their breath during the last few seconds of the quarter or something, right? Like there's a lot of emotion that goes into athletics, and a athlete that understands that is actually better in control of their interoceptive performance.
So how exactly does like these two works together?
So it has to do with the way that the brain processes information, and exteroceptive information is processed in the somatosensory cortex, but there is extensions from the somatosensory cortex into the area that interoceptive information is processed. You could also say that an athlete or an individual who is more in tune with their body, so mind-body connection, sometimes we think about that just from a more like a yoga or a meditative perspective, is right, like, mind, muscle, meditative, that skill is not just around kind of emotional control, but my mind muscle allows me to accurately perceive the alignment of my body, right? So it actually goes very, very hand in hand. And I would say, like, let's say dancers have a very good skill or ability to cross interoception and exteroception. Part of it is because of the grace or detail of their movement, right? So picture a dancer. They're very in control of their body. They have this deep relationship with the ground. And if they're dancing with someone else, they're in tune with the external environment and another person, right? But then, because dance is so emotionally expressive, and a lot of dance is based off of them helping us to feel something through their dance, right? So they have to be able to find that emotional connection within themselves to express it to the audience. That's an interoceptive skill. So that's what I would love to see, that level of connection in, soccer, football, basketball, all sports, that every type of athlete can dance back and forth between the external relationship and their internal relationship.
So let's say if I want to teach my athlete that kind of like the balance between these two, how exactly should I be like teaching them? Is it through like breathing, or?
I was actually going to say breathing. Breath work is probably the easiest way to do it. Another way to do it is through visualization. So I find that visualizing a skill or a movement before you do it, or to execute that skill with the eyes shut, draws the athlete inward to really connect to the subtlety of the movement. Another way that I will teach coaches and professionals to do that is to use things like compression apparel, vibration, boso, wrist weights, weighted vests. But if you add resistance to a movement, it has to be light. So we're talking about like 1 kg that you're adding to them to just lightly wake up the proprioceptive and kind of that fascial system, and then have that be the focus of the movement, right? And then do both styles, right? They still need to be able to do large, 1 rep max, Olympic lifts and things like that to create that execution, but can it be led with this undertone of a connection to the subtleties of the body and then to the breath?
Is it kind of like muscle activation, kind of, but not really like that?
Kind of, yeah. So, if let's say an athlete is about to do like a deadlift, right? Are they activating their fascial system through a pre-tensioning contraction, right? Or a pre-tensioning response within the body? And then it's just the skill of the coach or the trainer to then reference that, right? So as they do that, just hold that and sit with that and just connect to that sensation of the body. Maybe have them shut their eyes at the bottom of a deadlift while they're pre-tensioning to just feel what that feels like in their body, right? So yes, muscle contractions create a response or a sensation in the body.
Cool. So I want to go back to like breathing. So when you teach your client how to like breathe, I know there's probably a lot of ways to teach breathing, but when it's like rudimentary, how do you like teach your client to breathe and what to focus on?
I always start on the floor, on the back, with one hand on the sternum and one hand on the belly with the eyes shut. And I take them through 3-dimensional breathing. So I want them to feel that the first dimension is that they are going below their rib cage so that their abdomen is expanding. So you want them to feel that first dimension. And then the second dimension, once they connect to that, is that the rib cage is expanding laterally and posteriorly. So belly is rising, rib cage is expanding. And then the third dimension is I want them to be able to breathe down into the base of their pelvis. So there's this downward relaxation. The pelvic floor doesn't totally relax, but there's this downward relaxation. And then can they coordinate that on the exhalation to feel that there's a lift of the pelvic floor, that the rib cage is coming in, and that the belly is falling? So can they get the 3 dimensions kind of expanding and relaxing with every breath? If they have that, then you're essentially just bringing them more and more into gravity to be able to maintain that pattern in these different gravitational relationships. I will then have them focus on end range expiration. So can they really extend the exhalation? And the goal of end range exhalation is that it's very activating to the pelvic floor. So it gets them into the deep stabilizing structures without having to cue it in any way. All you're doing is cueing the breath, and the result is deep core activation.
So you mentioned like the pelvic floor. Why is the pelvic floor so like important?
So our pelvic floor, which is the base of the pelvis, is myofascially connected to so many other stabilizers of our pelvis and our torso, right? The whole torso. The pelvic floor myofascially blends into our transverse abdominals. It blends into the deep sacral fibers of our glute max, goes into the deep hip rotator, specifically obturator internus. It goes up into our diaphragm, and then your psoas actually comes down and it goes back into the pelvic floor. So you have this vast spider web connection of the pelvic floor that is deeply integrated into how we breathe because it's connected to the diaphragm. And it is influential into how our hip stabilizes, our low back, our anterior hip, so like your adductors, and a lot of stress that translates in all directions from the pelvis starts in that pelvic floor.
So the pelvic connected with the breathing, connected with the brain, and it also connected with our foot, am I right?
Yes, so via our deep front line, our pelvic floor connects down to our feet. And what's interesting is the parts of the foot that your pelvic floor is connected to is actually your toe flexors. So when your toes push down into the ground through your flexors, that is the part that's myofascially connected to the pelvic floor, and it's specifically your posterior pelvic floor. So this action of deep pelvis stabilization, which remember your pelvic floor connects into your glutes. So pelvic floor glute stabilization or connection makes sense to be connected to your feet, specifically your toes, because if you're thinking of sprinting or jumping, that's a lot of hip extension, and hip extension is coupled with plantar flexion of the ankle, dorsiflexion of the digits. You get that triple extension effect that is essentially saying that's built into your fascial lines.
So since we brought up like foot and the foot extensor, right? Am I right?
The
So
foot flexors, when we plantar flex.
yeah,
Yes, so that's our flexors.
yeah. So when it comes to like foot, how exactly do we like take, I mean, when we land on our gate, how exactly do we perceive the force, the force?
So the way that we perceive impact forces is based off of the sensory stimulation of impact, which is vibration. And if you are able to feel the vibration, then you are able to hopefully more accurately absorb it, because impact is our body's energy. So if you want an athlete to run fast or jump high, they need to be able to utilize the ground for energy, and they're utilizing impact forces and vibration, right? So vibration, which is impact, is absorbed through tensioning and stiffening the foot and ankle complex through isometric contractions. And a lot of that starts with our intrinsics, which are found in the bottom of the foot. So when you push your toes down into the floor, which is called short foot, it's a way that you could do it, you are stiffening the intrinsics of the foot. And that's where everything starts. So when I work with athletes, I need the athlete to have the capacity to rapidly stiffen the foot before their foot strikes the ground so that they can absorb it and release it, right? We don't want the shoe to be doing all of that action. Some of that has to be inherently within our body, because humans are naturally designed to absorb impact, right? Think of like a gymnast doing, back handsprings into a triple back, right? So I'm just kind of making up one example of a tumbling pass, right? They are experiencing with each handspring 15 to 18 times their body weight in impact forces, right? So that sounds like a lot, but how else would they be able to do a triple back unless they were harnessing all of that potential energy, right? They're storing it and storing it and storing it. So when they're ready to release it into a triple back, they have the energy to do that, right? So the body is naturally designed to withstand very high impact forces. It's just that we have to train the body to do that. And I try to build that into programming versus saying the shoe is supposed to do it.
So how exactly do you build up into your program? Can you give us some example?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example of a slow progression, because most of the people that I would see would be coming off of an injury, let's say, or they're trying to move away from structured shoes into a more minimal environment and then to optimize their function in the minimal environment. So it's usually one of those two. Is I take them through different phases, where the first phase that I'm trying to create is just an awareness of the feet and foundational stability. So I will have them release their feet, stimulate their feet every day. I'll have them get in touch with their breath work, right? So we do, 4 to 6 weeks of just focused pelvic floor activation, diaphragmatic breathing, end range expiration, foot tripod. So can they set their base, and then can they activate their intrinsics? So just kind of basic stuff, right? And then from there, I would progress into phase 2, which is just adding another layer of strength on top of this stability. And that strength is not ballistic at this moment. It is static strength. It's incorporating single leg stances, obviously incorporating the breath throughout this. And then the third phase is, depending on the track of the individual, either I load them, so I'm starting to load their strength, or I add a dynamic nature to the strength, right? So we kind of play with it. Are we going to increase the load, increase kind of the quickness of the contraction, which is the ballistic nature, or am I trying to incorporate endurance, right? So it'll kind of go into one of those. If I start to load them, ultimately I want to add endurance to that strength with load. And then ultimately everyone has to be able to contract quickly. So it's just a matter of how do those three, in what order do I add those based off of the individual and their goals.
Cool. So on your online webinar, you mentioned that when we walk, I can't remember the exact number? Is it like how many times body weight we perceive on our foot and how many times when it's running or like sprinting? Can you like walk us through?
Yes. So when we walk, every time our foot strikes the ground, we experience 1 to 1.5 times our body weight in impact. Okay. Remember, that's potential energy. We're going to store it and then we're going to release it. By the time we release that energy when we're walking, we actually release 2.5 times our body weight. So you bring in 1.5 and you release 2.5. So you are essentially doubling the amount of energy that is coming in by the time you release it, right? That's important because that is truly what it means to move efficiently, is that you're demonstrating this ability to compound energy, okay? When we run and your foot strikes the ground, this is regardless of it being heel, midfoot, forefoot, doesn't matter. You are experiencing 2 to 3 times your body weight. And then by the time you release that energy, you are releasing about 5 to 6 times your body weight. Okay. Again, the emphasis is on the ability for us to compound the energy that's coming in. That is based off of fascial tissue. That's the muscle tuning theory. That is what it means to be efficient. And that is really what I focus on when I work with athletes or individuals, is I need to harness the ability to compound energy, not to just bring it in and release it. If I release 1.5 times my body weight at push off, that's actually not enough. That's not enough energy. I have no choice but to create more energy internally, which is work, which is exhausting. And obviously your caloric expenditure goes up. That's not a good thing. You do not want your caloric expenditure to go up unless you are very strategically doing that from like a weight loss perspective. So when someone's going up incline walking or doing stairs, you're essentially trying to play with the efficiency of that system. But that's where people get injured. So all the different itises that you see is based off of people engaging their muscles harder than they should be. They're working hard.
Is it how exactly do you like double the number of body weight when push off? Is it like the things you mentioned?
Yes. So our ability to do that is based off of rapid isometric contractions to stiffen and store the energy in our connective tissue, and then to properly release 2 times, you have to be stable, right? So if the hip isn't stable, if the pelvis isn't stable, if the foot isn't stable, you cannot release that amount of energy. And then that's where people get injured, right? And that's where we would say, I'm essentially explaining in a very complex way, where we would say, oh, why does someone with flat feet get plantar fasciitis? Why does a runner with overpronation get shin splints? Right? I'm essentially explaining to you that the system is going to break somewhere in an injury. Pick an injury, right? I gave a couple of them. And the reason is because they're not stable quick enough at the right moment to transfer that compounding effect of energy. They can't control it, and therefore they're getting injured.
So starting from the bottom up would be like probably most efficient, yeah, or easiest way.
Yes, it should be part of everyone's program. And since many people, not everyone, but many people don't look at the foot right now, it is most likely something that is going to powerfully change the individual's program.
Yeah. So next thing I want to discuss is like in the online webinar, you also mentioned that there's like 3 parts of the brain, and how exactly does like emotion affects the fascia works?
Yes. So I'm very much into emotion because the emotion that we feel affects our breathing. Okay. And if I'm feeling anxious, upset, whatever the emotion that I'm feeling, it's going to be reflective in the way that I breathe. Most people will breathe in a more supradiaphragmatic way. It'll be kind of shallow breathing. It'll be accessory muscles. If we alter the way that we breathe based off of our emotion, we alter the connection between the diaphragm and the pelvic floor, which then affects the deep front line, the deep hip stabilizers, the timing of the glutes, the transverse abdominal. So everything else that we discussed starts to get shifted because, again, the breath work, right? But here, the reason of the breath work is not a lack of awareness of the athlete, right? But it's actually the subconscious emotion that's affecting the breath work, which is why I always encourage and tell people that you can't just teach how to breathe without thinking or factoring in emotion, because emotion is, we all have emotions, we're all human, right? So good day, bad day, stressed out, anxious, happy, right? So all these different things, and we have to factor that in and harness the skill of emotional awareness and emotional flexibility in our athletes so that they can override that if they need to make sure that their breath is staying controlled. Or a very astute individual would be able to use their breath work to control their emotional state, right? They kind of go back and forth, right? So one is influencing the other, but I can use the skill to use my breath to control my emotional state, right? To bring me back into a sympathetic or a parasympathetic state.
So how exactly do we use like breathing to to gain control of our emotion?
Yeah, so there's a lot. This is where like yoga does a lot of work around it, different yogic type breathing. They'll do like alternating nostril breathing, right? They do a lot of, through the nose. They'll do this 3-dimensional breathing. So belly breathing or Buddha breathing, things that are just slowing the system down, right? And a big part also of this alternating breath where you're inhaling and then you're exhaling through the other nostril. Part of it is that you're breathing through your nose. Part of it's that it's slowing you down, but the other part is it's forcing me to be present because I have to focus on something and count. So I'm just forced to be present. And that's what a lot of breath work does, is it just forces you to be present.
Kind of like meditation, am I right?
100%. Yes. Yep. I try to not tell certain people that it's meditating because they don't want to do meditation or they have an association with meditation, especially some athletes. Again, I'm not stereotyping in any way, but some athletes may be like, I'm not doing that, right? I'm not going to sit and chant and do meditation, but could you do it in a way that forces them to be present and they don't even realize that they're doing that?
Cool. So I want to go back to can you introduce to us what is the 3-part of the brain and how is it working differently and how does it work together?
Yes. So our brain, this is based off of the triune brain theory, which is a theory. So just kind of taking that for what it is, but we have the brainstem, we have our limbic system, and then we have our neocortex. So you have the brainstem, which is the oldest. Limbic system is then the next from age, and then the neocortex is obviously the newest. The brainstem is where you have your cranial nerves. So you'll have the autonomic nervous system in the brainstem. A lot of people will say that that's our reptilian brain. So that's kind of baseline survival needs, right? And because that also ties into the autonomic nervous system, that's our perception of safety, right? Safety survival is based off of that. Limbic system is kind of like the middle of the brain. It's not the midbrain, but it's the middle of the brain. And that is more emotion. It's also a little bit more sophistication of needs. It's actually where you'll find the wake-sleep cycles where we regulate our temperature. Your basal ganglia is small muscle movements, so eye muscle movements. Your basal ganglia also affects larger movements. So there's a lot of research around the basal ganglia. Your hippocampus is there, which is memory. And then your neocortex, which is the new cortex, is, language, somatosensory cortex. So much more sophisticated movement patterns are based off of the neocortex, right? So you could kind of say like, okay, we need to survive, and then we put emotion onto that survival, and then we add movement on top of that, right? So they all interrelate with each other, and they really should be factored in. The survival component is kind of tying into the emotion, right? Limbic system is also motivation. So it's also finding a deeper motivation for people, and then obviously push forward into the neocortex.
Cool. So that means like 3 parts of the brain works together, and it also affects all our body, how we move, we breathe, and the fascia system, right?
Yes, and then how we prioritize what's coming in, right? There is a very good book called Smart Moves by Carla Hannaford, and she uses the triune brain theory to explain how movement is necessary for learning. She happens to be speaking about children, right? But everyone can benefit from this. And it's essentially showing that movement allows us to connect to these other aspects of the brain. If we don't feel safe, we're not going to learn. How does movement connect to our body? If I connect to my body, I feel safe. And just kind of that interplay with the 3 different areas to then optimize. Her end goal was to learn, but with trainers and coaches, we could say, okay, well, if you're teaching a complex kettlebell movement, you're teaching something, it's a skill they need to learn, right? In order for the individual to do that skill, they have to be present, they have to have an awareness of their body, they have to be able to prioritize what you're teaching them so they can hear you and execute it. So it's actually a complex aspect of learning movement skill as well.
Cool. That's amazing. New thing for me.
Good.
So the book is called like
Smart Moves.
Okay, definitely gonna Google that.
Good.
So last thing, okay? So I know last time we talked a lot about barefoot training, and besides barefoot, is there like other way to train our foot and other ways to help us double up the number of like the energy we perceive to the energy we transfer to the ground?
Yes. So I use short foot, which is the toes pushing into the ground. The one thing that I see people doing is they're trying to load up short foot. Meaning that, in various ways, they're trying to just load from like a 1 rep max, we'll call it, right? Even though it's not fully a 1 rep max. But that's the way that a lot of people think about foot strength. What I would actually encourage people is to think about foot strength as integrated with the core. So every time, if you're even loading short foot, is the contraction of the foot coordinated with the core and the breath? If it's not, why are we loading it, right? Because that's foot strength has to be connected into the core and to the diaphragm, because that's functionally how it's used. Second one is that the true function of the foot is not based off of, like, we're not trying to hypertrophy these muscles necessarily. Yes, does research show that you get hypertrophy in these muscles? Yeah, but the hypertrophy is so different than hypertrophy of like the quads or the glutes or the bicep. They're just completely different muscles, right? It's like saying, I want to hypertrophy my supraspinatus. Like, no one says that, right? That's not the goal of why you do different stabilization of the shoulder, right? So the way that you actually use foot strength for the dynamics of what you're talking about is the ability to very rapidly contract and relax the foot, which means I would rather you do, bounding, lateral jumps, box jumps, step downs. You're doing something, where they're maybe there and then you blow a whistle. So it's kind of reactive isometric, right? So quick contractions of short foot that are integrated with the foot and core. And then can they still do that while you add a conscious, complex aspect to it? So the dual tasking of it, right? Or a lot of people will do the lights, right? So they're doing different kind of reactive training, right? Something with the lights, right? But while they're doing that, can they keep the same rapid stiffening response in the foot to core complex? That's really what we're trying to do with an athlete, right? Versus load them and do various foot strength like you're training the rectus abdominis. Doesn't work that way, right? So that would be the one thing that I would highly encourage people to think about.
Cool, but when we like load the foot, how about if I want to strengthen the Achilles tendon? I mean,
Then, yep. So loading makes sense, right? But the load should be like a rucksack, or it should be on you. But you're still, can you control that load rapidly, right? And create endurance and be able to dual task at the same time.
so it means that we need to do all the things like you mentioned. And can I also add something like ISO hold for the
You could
foot?
do that. Yep. ISO holds are great, right? ISO holds are good because they're potentiating the muscle, right? So I like potentiation. And what I would kind of say and encourage the listeners when they're doing something is don't forget that whatever you're doing, you're training the nervous system. So if you're doing an ISO hold, what is that doing to the nervous system? When you load up and you do quick contractions or endurance based, what is that doing to the nervous system? Just kind of add this layer that I am always training the nervous system, right? And I hope that that helps the listeners. To me, it's changed the way that I look at performance, injury, optimization. Is I'm always looking through this perspective of the brain, because the brain is what's controlling everything, right? Like we would not move if we didn't have a brain. So everything we do to optimize our athletes or our clients is based off of neuro manipulation or stimulation. Make sense?
Yeah, love this. Love this.
Okay.
Appreciate it. So if there's like any like coaches or therapists are interested in what we're talking about today, where can they reach out to you?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram. The Functional Foot Doc is my Instagram. EBFA for any of our courses and our webinars that you were referencing is ebfaglobal.com. And then any of the Novoso products is naboso.com. And then they could even just go to YouTube and Google Dr. Emily Barefoot, and you'll see hundreds of videos for you.
Well, I noticed that you changed your Instagram account, right?
Oh, yes. The world of hackers got my Instagram. So if you thought you were following me before, just make sure you're definitely following me.
Cool. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you.